Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. Hope you're having a good week. Hope everything's going the way you want it to go. You have your Bibles with you this morning. Turn to the book of 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Have some that are out this morning. Look around and see those that are out. Give them a call this week. I'm sure they'd appreciate being known that they were missed, as we do miss them. George Schultz drew a cartoon of Charlie Brown some time ago. And Charlie Brown is bemoaning the fact that he's lost again. And Lucy says, "Cheer up, Charlie." Said, "We learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes any time in life." And to which the next panel, Charlie Brown says, "Then I must be the smartest man on earth." We often feel like we lose. We feel like we face life and life just keeps kicking us. It keeps, if you will, throwing the proverbial sand in our face. We just can't win for losing. Bad times, hard times, difficult times. And yet how do we deal with those? The Bible teaches us as Christians really how to deal with those issues of life. Because no matter who you are, no matter what point in your life you are, you'll face difficulties. You'll have problems. You'll have heartaches. You'll have setbacks. And we don't wish for those all the time, but yet at the same time, too, we know that there's purpose. And in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, Paul has been dealing with the idea of boasting. Now, that's an interesting aspect. But you see, evidently, there was a charge made against Paul, not just on one occasion, but on many. Paul was a man seemingly of arrogance. And Paul was trying to explain that his boasting was not of himself, but was of the Lord. And simply put, what he was talking about was of the Lord. And so consequently, he says, "Look, I need you to know that I too have faced problems, that I'm just like you." And so Paul deals with that aspect of this thorn in the flesh. Now, I've said before, and I'll say again, don't know what his thorn in the flesh was. Have no idea. There have been speculations through the years, but they're just that. They're speculations. Nobody knows because the scriptures don't tell us. We do know that it was something that was bothersome to him. It was something that, if you will, was not pleasant to experience. It was not pleasant to go through. It was not pleasant. And so consequently, Paul says that on 3 occasions he asked the Lord that this thorn in the flesh might be removed. But there's some other things around that, and that's what we often key on, that one little verse. But there's some things around that verse that deal with Paul and his thorn in the flesh and how he dealt with that issue. Well, what did he do? Well, the first thing is that you got to come to an understanding of your troubles. Look at verse 7. He says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelation, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above all." Paul says, I want you to think about something. Paul says, "Lest I should be exalted above measure." Paul says, you think I'm proud, you think I'm boastful, but he says, I was given a thorn in the flesh. I was given a problem. I was given something that stayed with me. It was not, if you will, a headache that's here today and gone tomorrow. It was not evidently something that, if you will, was an ache or pain, and I'm sure he had those, but it was not just an ache or a pain that was here today and gone tomorrow. It was something, an ache and pain maybe, that stayed with him. But Paul says, need you to understand something. That my problem came to keep me humble. My problem came so that I wouldn't be exalted above measure. My problem had a purpose. My problem had a reason. My problem had a purpose to it, a point to it. You see, we sometimes we'll take our grandchildren or our children as they were growing up, and we trying to teach them 2 + 2 is 4, and we'll give them 2 of something, and we'll give them 2 of something else, and we'll say, now how many do you have? And then 1, 2, 3, 4. And they'll count to 4. Yes, very good. But we have a purpose for that, didn't we? It wasn't just to take up time or to entertain them. It might have been to catch our breath, but it had a reason. We were teaching them. Paul says, I want you to know I had a thorn in the flesh, but the reason I had a thorn in the flesh was to keep me humble. It had a purpose. And so he says, this thorn in the flesh was a messenger of Satan. It was that ultimately which Paul says, it buffeted me. It kept me humble. And so he says, once again, lest I should be exalted above measure. But think about and understand whatever problems you're going through, whatever problems you've been through, and whatever problems you will face in the future, while certain, have a purpose and have a reason. One of the things that problems do in our life, and admittedly, we say, I don't like problems. And there are a lot of folks that point to the fact that they say, well, Christians say you don't have problems. No, Christians don't say that. They say you got problems, but here's how you deal with them. But they'll say, this denies the existence of a loving and caring God, because if God loved you and God cared for you, then you wouldn't have problems. You just need to understand, though, folks, those problems have a purpose. They strip us of our vanity and our pride. They do keep us humble. David in Psalm 119, verse 67 says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. And then just read on down a couple more verses in verse 71 of that same 119th Psalm. And he says, it was good for me to be afflicted, for therein have I learned your statutes. Excuse me. David says here, I really understand and appreciate the fact that I had problems. Now, who of us would say that? Who of us would say, all right, here's the line for problems. You want to get in? No, not me. I want to find that line where there's no problems. I want to find that line where there's a there's a sandy beach somewhere, and you sit back and you don't worry about anything. But that doesn't happen. But it is those problems. Those problems cause us to be humble enough that our pride is stripped away, for we realize that it's not us. We're not dependent upon us. We're dependent upon God. And so we depend upon Him for His grace, for His mercy, for His strength. For we know that He'll strengthen us. And He'll strengthen us through His Word. And He'll strengthen us through our friends. And He'll strengthen us through folks that we come in contact with, and He'll strengthen us as we get through it. And once we see the other end of it, and we look back and we say, man, look what happened. Look how with God's help I got through it. And so while it strips and it strengthens, we also got to know that it polishes us. It makes us better. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Oh, we look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are not seen. The things that are seen, what are they? Well, they're temporal. And so Paul says, our light affliction. That's an interesting concept. I wonder if Paul was thinking about his thorn in the flesh when he made that statement in the 4th chapter. I wonder if he was thinking about the difficulties of his life. Our light affliction, our simple things, our little things, our little problems. But he says our light afflictions are just really for a moment. But he says they work in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. You see, they're working on us. They're buffing us up. They're making us better. For God says, I have chosen you out of the furnace of affliction, Isaiah wrote. And Isaiah 41, excuse me. God says, I'm polishing you. I'm making you better. I'm removing the rough edges. I'm working on you. But then our problems help us look for something better. For Paul himself, once again, would write in book of Romans this time, the 8th chapter, and the 18th verse, as he's writing to the church at Rome, one of the greatest chapters. I'm not saying the greatest because all of them are great, but one of, in my opinion, the greatest chapters of the Bible, because he talks about so many different things. He talks about no condemnation, verse 1, as he begins, and he ends by talking about victory in Jesus, for we're more than conquerors through him that loved us. But in the 18th verse of that chapter, Paul says, for I suppose, that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in heaven. The better end to this. And the troubles of this life make me wish for, long for, look for, anticipate, and even yearn for, and thus strive for a better ending. And so you see the patience that comes then from the suffering that we endure. All come because we come to understand. We understand through a reading of his word why we're going through those troubles. And Paul understood why he had his troubles. You see, it's much like the story of a little boy and little girl that were climbing up a hill. And they were racing to see who could get to the top. And it was a struggle. It was not just one of these short hills. It was very tall, very steep. And it was a struggle to get to the top. And the little boy was ahead of the little girl, and just seemed like with each step he was getting a little further ahead of her, and she was getting upset and disgusted. And finally she said, hey, wait up. She said, I can't get there for all of these little bumps on the hill. And he says, the bumps are what you climb on. Dear friends, the bumps of life are what you climb on to heaven. And Paul realized that. And so he came to an understanding that his problems were just simply bumps to climb on, to get to the next bump, to get to the next bump, to get to heaven. But then secondly, if we're going to deal with our problems, we have to not only know what, if you will, what the purpose of those problems are. We need to keep our head up. Look at what Paul said in verse 9. When Paul asked that his thorn in the flesh be removed, notice the Lord's answer. He said to me, my strength is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. Now understand that's the answer that Paul gave. Now look at Paul's reaction to the Lord's answer. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of God, or power of Christ, may rest upon me. Paul said, hey, I got it. I got it. Since the Lord has told me, I'm not going to remove it, but I'm going to give you what you need to get through it. Paul says, I can live with that. I can keep my chin up. I can keep going. You know, when we go through problems, we go through difficulties, it's hard to keep chin up, isn't it? It's hard to keep going. We get depressed. We get down. We begin to wonder, is it ever going to get better? Not only is it ever going to get better, but is it going to be something that is going to be with me forever? But is this something, is it going to get worse? You know, what's going to happen? How am I going to do it? The questions flood the mind. Depression sets in sometimes, discouragement, doubt, distress. All those D words that are negative words begin to come into our thinking and into our vocabulary as we're upset about what's going on, and rightfully so. But what we have to learn to do is keep our head up. Keep going. What did the Lord do? He answered Paul. Well, you preacher, you see, that's my problem. I talk to God and he doesn't answer me. I'm sure he does. Right here in his word. He just says, keep going. Keep going. Keep chin up. It's going to be all right. It's all right. You're going to get through this. You may think you're not going to get through it, but you're going to get through it somehow, some way. You're going to get through it. Keep your chin up. A man one time walking through the city saw a lady that seemingly was down on her luck. She was She was not dressed too well. Her clothes, matter of fact, were quite shabby and didn't match. And he just felt like, things were bad for her. And so as they walked the next block and he walked behind her, he had pulled out, during that walk of that block, he pulled out a little money out of his billfold. And as they stopped at the stoplight to wait so that they could cross, he slipped the money in her hand. And he said, "Chin up." He kept walking. The next day, he's walking once again to his job. And as he walks, all of a sudden he feels something. As he's waiting in a red light, he feels something in his hand. And he looks over, and it's that lady. And she slipped money in his hand, and she says, "Hey, it was your good day. Chin up, won 5-1 race yesterday afternoon." Now, I don't agree with gambling. I don't agree with gambling. Don't get me wrong. And sometimes we get a little messed up in our interpretation. But we need to keep our chin up. We need to learn to laugh sometimes. We need to understand that there are folks in the Bible that went through similar situations. Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. He's right. There's nothing new under the sun. And we think about heroes of the Bible. We think about Joseph and Elijah. We think about Paul. We think about Peter. Yea, we even think about our Lord. We think about great heroes of the Bible most specifically. And when we think about these heroes, one of the things that we find out is not that they didn't have problems. It's how they dealt with their problems. It's not that they didn't have problems. It's not that they weren't vulnerable. But it was how they overcame their problems. How Joseph was sold by his brothers and sold into slavery. And ultimately then, remember when he interpreted dreams, he was forgotten. And he eventually, though, he got it, if you will, the expression among some young, he got good. You think about old Job and you think about all he lost. But then you go keep reading, you find that in the first couple of chapters of Job, but you get to Job chapter 41 and Job chapter 42, and you find out that God blessed him many times over from what he had before. You go look at Daniel and you find out that he was thrown in the lion's den, but guess what? He came out on the other side. You think about Jonah, who was down in the mouth, but Jonah came out. You think about Paul, and you think about, and we're reading in 1 Corinthians 12, but if you go back to chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, and you find out Paul talks about his shipwrecks and his beatings and his tumults and his distresses and his persecution and all of his problems. And you might say, well, how do you get through it? Hold your head up. Put a smile on your face. Keep going. Don't stop. Don't let it get you down. Don't be discouraged. Move forward. But next in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we learn to deal with our problems, face our troubles in life by turning to God in prayer. Notice, once again, this time verse 8. Concerning this thing, that thorn in the flesh, Paul said, I pled with the Lord 3 times that it might be removed from me. Whatever this thorn in the flesh was, it was bothersome. And it was bothersome to the point that Paul is willing to say, what do I do? And so he turns to the most logical of one that has the answer. He turns to God. God, help me. God, remove this from me. God, take it from me. God, would you please do something about this? I don't know exactly what his prayers were because we don't know exactly what his thorn in the flesh was. But he says, this thing, I asked the Lord. I asked him not once, I asked him not twice, I asked him 3 times. In other words, I am continuing to ask him to remove this thorn in the flesh. I didn't just ask once. Now, don't get mixed up in the idea of quantity makes quality. In other words, got to ask the Lord 3 times. No. The idea is you keep asking. You turn to the Lord. You see, the Lord commands us to pray, doesn't he? You know, we know 1 Thessalonians 5, pray without ceasing. Men ought always, Luke 18:1, always pray, not to faint. We know those verses, boy, we can quote those, and we feel confident. God says pray. But what do I pray for? What do I pray for? You pray what's on your heart. Your words don't have to always be right. This is one of the times your grammar doesn't have to be correct. The things that you say just simply come from the heart. They may not be in an order that you really would put them in if you gave them much thought. But you share with God what's going on in your life. You share with God the decisions that you have to make. You share with God the things that are taking place in your life. The disturbances, the doubts, the disappointments. You share with him all of those things. You share with him all the distresses in your life. And you're assured of this. The eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open to the prayers. You're assured, that's 1 Peter 5, you're assured as well in Jeremiah 33, verse 3, call upon me and I will answer. You're assured of 2 Chronicles 7, verse 14, if my people which are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I will turn to them and I will hear them. The master of all, the master, the creator of the universe and all things therein, the master of the earth, heaven and earth and all things, has said, guess what? I will listen to you. I will help you. I will give you what you need. But you have to pray. Have we thought about, have we spent time thinking about how prayer affects the providence of God? You see, we like the idea of the providence of God, don't we? We like the idea that God's going to work all things together for good to those that love the Lord and called according to his purpose. We love that idea. We hold to that verse. That's one of those verses, you know, if we can only quote one verse of the Bible, that may be the one verse that we want, especially in times of difficulty. But have we thought about prayer's effect on the providence of God? Hezekiah was told, get ready, buddy. You're going to die. And Hezekiah turned his face towards the wall and he prayed, and God gave him 15 more years. Elijah. Ahab and Jezebel, they had done a deal, hadn't they? Jezebel had killed all the prophets of God, or at least Elijah thought it was all the prophets of God. And God says, no, I got a few more saved up. But Elijah was in great distress. Remember, he'd had the run-in with the prophets of Baal and all of that wonderful story. And then, guess what? When Elijah is down and desperate and hurting, he prays, and God delivers him. Hannah, in 1 Samuel, the first chapter, is without child. Peninnah, her, in many ways, arch rival. But Elkanah, her husband, also had married not only Hannah, but Peninnah as well. Peninnah had children considered to be a blessing from God, a blessing of God, and Hannah had none. And it grieved Hannah. And in 1 Samuel, the first chapter, beginning in verse 8, what does Hannah do? She prays to God. And what happens? She's blessed with child. You see, we have to understand that prayer is not just getting it off of our hearts and out of our minds. It's delivering it to a God that has the power to deliver. And so when you're faced with problems in life, be sure to open up your prayer life and pray. But next, accept what you cannot change. Look in verse 10. Therefore, I take pleasures in infirmities and reproaches and persecutions and distress for Christ's sake. for when I'm weak, then I am strong. You know, there are things in life you can't change. Now think about verse 10. It's right after verse 9 where God says, my grace is sufficient for you. Paul says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches. Paul says, all right, I can't change this. I've asked God to change it. God says no, and God does sometimes say no. Of course, the reality of it was, you know, and is, we understand how God answers prayers. Sometimes he says yes, sometimes he says no. Sometimes he says wait, but also sometimes he gives us a substitute. That's really what he did for Paul. He didn't tell him no. He gave him a substitute. What did he give him? My grace is sufficient for you. Paul had to accept that. Paul had to accept the fact that there were certain things he could not change. He had done what he could do. He had carried it to God. God had said, my grace is sufficient for you. Paul says, therefore I take pleasure. None of us like the idea of pleasure in infirmities. But Paul says, I take pleasure. I take pleasure in infirmities and distresses for Christ's sake, for when I'm weak, then I'm strong. You see, Paul understood that he really needed to accept what he could not change. There are things in life we cannot change. There are things that happen to us that we cannot change. There are things that happen in life that we cannot change. There are times in which we do everything we can, and yet we still cannot change those things. Well, we need to learn to accept them. Well, what does that mean? Well, Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, Paul said, do all things without murmuring and complaining. Don't complain. I'm not complaining, preacher. I'm just telling you. I'm not complaining to my neighbor. I'm just telling him. I understand. And there is a difference. And sometimes you have to report the news because we ask. But at the same time, Sue, get off your pity box. Oh, well, that's hard to do, boy. I know it. I know it's hard to do. But accept what you can't change. Move forward. Accept what you can't change and go on. Paul said in Philippians, the same book that we just quoted a while ago, Philippians chapter 4, he said, I've learned whatever state I am to be happy. That's what the word means. It's actually the translation. It's content. I've learned in whatsoever state. Paul didn't say that he learned that in a book. Paul didn't say, well, you know, I went to school, Gamaliel school, and, you know, he opened up a book and he showed me it says be content, so I'm happy. Paul said, I learned. The word learned there is the idea of a learn through experience. Have you ever done something, you know, we classify, well, why did I do that? That was silly or that was stupid. And then later on, we don't make that mistake again. And the reason we don't make the mistake, if we think about it, is I remember back when I did that, and that was not the thing to do. Well, that's what Paul says. I've learned. Learn to be happy where I am. There are certain things can't change. And those things that I cannot change, I learn to live with. I learn to live with them. I learn to accept them. I learn to say, okay, they're part of life. In John, the 16th chapter, Jesus pretty much tells us we're going to have troubles, but he says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world give I unto you. You see, he says, I'm going to give you a peace. Just simply accept what you can't change. Story is told of two old cowboys that went out. It was out west. It was in the days of wrangling steers, and they were going out to get a wild steer, and they carried with them an old burro. People wondered why those two old cowboys had carried an old burro with them to get this wild steer and bring it home. But nevertheless, they went and they found that old steer. They roped that old wild steer. And in roping it, they also tied that old burro around his neck with the old steer. They were tied together. Well, the old steer just bucked and jumped and everything to get that old burro away from him. Nothing to do. He'd fall down, the burro would fall down with him. But each time they got up, the burro took one step closer home. Till finally, a couple of days later, the old cowboys came in with what seemingly was the most docile of old steers. He looked pretty bad. He looked malnourished. But the old burro had brought him home. See, in life, we simply need to accept what we cannot change. Why? Because God will take care of you. Look in verse 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. God has chosen us in the furnace of affliction, it says in Isaiah 41. Psalm 66. Let me write that down, at least in your mind or on a card or in your Bible. Read Psalm 66 this week. As the psalmist will talk about how that he went through troubles. And he says, in the end, you brought me out of it to a fulfilled life. I got through it, and I got through it to a fulfilled life. God has promised, I'll take care of you. I'll get you through it. Be all right. We don't always get to pick our endings, and sometimes our endings aren't the way we want them to be. But we have the promise that my grace is sufficient for you. I'll take care of you. And so therefore, dear friends, let's remember that while we need to understand why we go through these problems, we need to keep our chin up and pray to God as we accept what we cannot change, knowing that God will take care of us. Let us remember what Paul said, and Paul wrote to the church of Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. Not that we're sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God. He will take care of you. If you need to respond to his invitation this morning, won't you come? While together we stand and sing.